What is going on, alpha males? Welcome to the Alpha Male Podcast. The podcast where we talk about what it means to be a man the right way, with God at the center. And we don't apologize for that. Strong, dominant alpha males made in the image and likeness of our Creator. If you want to check out more while you're listening, go to goodshepherdtraining.com. Today's episode, going to be talking about a recent wilderness trip that I did. An overnight trip into some of the most remote wilderness I've ever been in. And lessons, I'll say, learned and relearned on that. Now, I'll confess part of that was because I've been struggling for content on the Alpha Male Podcast. Doing this for a living. Don't know this, Gunfighter Life, and Simple Man Sermons, the flagship. Doing this as a living, quit my management position, a good income, to do this full time. Although I love podcasting, I'm not always thinking about how to make money. I was hoping that a lot of people, a small portion, even a very small fraction of the people that download and listen to this would become patrons. That's been slower than I would have liked. So I'm looking for other ways you guys can support. If you don't want to be on Patreon, and I get that, it's not for everybody. It's $5 a month now to start. If you had done it earlier, I think you could do it for $1. $5 a month to start. If you guys don't want to do that, I get that, and not everybody wants to be a patron. If you want to support and want to get something out of it, there's some pretty cool merchandise. I added quite a bit more since the last Alpha Male Podcast, and by me I mean my wife and I. She likes doing that kind of graphic design and stuff like that. So if you've ever looked down at your coffee cup and thought, this is just not alpha enough for me. We have some really good enamel alpha male coffee cups. I don't just say that. I've used one for quite a while. I ordered the first one and I've been using it since, and I use it a lot. And my wife uses it probably more than me. We live tiny, we live simple. We don't have a lot of stuff. A good cup, especially a good metal cup, is worth a lot more to me than a ceramic cup. Not only can I just drink out of it, I can cook in it. So if you want a good day-to-day coffee cup, or you just want something to fly the alpha male banner, or a really good camping or outdoors cup to cook on a fire, it is a good utilitarian thing. You can check that out at goodshepherdtraining.com. There's a shop link up at the top. Likewise, there's a pretty cool alpha male phone case on there that I haven't even gotten mine yet. But it's an alpha male phone case. It's for a lot of the newer, more popular phones. It says alpha male really big on it, and podcast pretty small on there. It's just a cool phone case. And there's also the alpha male hoodie, tank top, and t-shirts on there. So if those the way you want to go to the gym, or just rep the Alpha Male Podcast because you are an alpha male. Anyway, those are on there. And since that is kind of a commercial, I won't put any in the middle of the podcast. They automatically, I think, go in the beginning and the end of the podcast. But if you want any of that stuff, again, appreciate the support on the podcast, goodshepherdtraining.com. With that, I'll plug in the bio. You may know the drill by now. If you want to skip it, skip around 3 minutes and 45 seconds from where it starts. Who am I? A question we should all ask ourselves. I am, first and foremost, a servant of God, made in His very own image, a follower of Jesus Christ, a simple man called by God to the Great Commission to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Next, a little bit about my background and what God has allowed me to do and blessed me to do in life. Grew up what most would consider very poor in the backwoods of the southeastern and mid-Atlantic United States. Hunting and fishing. Joined the Marine Corps at 17. Did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. So a decorated Marine Corps combat veteran. Infantry assaultman. After the combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor for the United States Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Also a veteran of law enforcement. I served with LAPD. I was a sworn peace officer, a cop for LAPD. I worked regular patrol assignments and more specialized assignments. One of those more specialized assignments was warrant service, fugitive recovery. Also had some other law enforcement roles. I am an FBI certified firearms instructor and been certified by another 3-letter government agency in a lot of firearms and training things. I've also been a private contractor, worked in the private sector pertaining to tactics and gunfighting and protecting America from enemies foreign and domestic. I served as the commander of a tactical team to stop active shooters in a large metropolitan area. That was our primary mission, to stop active shooters, which sadly are a thing in America today. I've also been blessed to do quite a bit of competition shooting. Started my first formal competitions even before joining the Marine Corps at 17. I had won more shooting competitions than I can remember. I have competed in all manner of disciplines in shooting. I've been blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion, West Coast regional champion. Like I said, been blessed to win more shooting competitions than I can remember. Mentioned hunting. I've hunted to put meat on the table starting when I was a child. I've also been a professional big game hunter and guide, hunting and slaying all manner of beast. And I don't apologize for that. Humbled to be the host of 3 podcasts: Simple Man Sermons, Alpha Male Podcast, and Gunfighter Life. Obviously, as things not mentioned, I've been blessed to do many other things. But, again, first and foremost, I'm a servant of God, a believer and follower of the Bible, the Word, Jesus Christ. And I don't apologize for that. With that, let's transition into today's topic. So, as mentioned in the prelude, I recently went on a wilderness excursion. I mean, deep wilderness. There are many reasons for this. First and foremost is and should be to spend time with God. For Jesus often withdrew into the wilderness in a solitary place. Even when people were seeking him, he withdrew. He often went out into the wilderness to pray. You'll see that mentioned many times in the Gospels. He also tells his disciples, go ye out into a desert place and rest a while, or into a secluded place and rest a while. I like that time in solitude. I like that time in God's creation without the hurried, busy markings of society. That's number one. Number two, I just legitimately really enjoy being in the wilderness. I really do. And although I love my wife and I love her company, I'm very blessed to have my wonderful wife. Sometimes solitude is healthy and good. Another reason for that, I'll be honest, is I was struggling to get content for the Alpha Male podcast. As I mentioned in the prelude, Gunfighter Life I also do, and by God's grace, the content for Simple Man Sermons comes from the Holy Spirit. But I was struggling to do several episodes a week of Alpha Male Podcast and have fresh new content for you guys. And sometimes it's good to step back and change your environment to help your brain reboot and think a different way. Today's podcast is going to be directly about that excursion and lessons learned, but I also came up with several other ideas by God's grace. I'm counting 5 other ideas for shows. And by God's grace, I was able to work and get ahead and do a week in advance or so before I went, so you guys weren't missing any content. And as I talked about before the bio, other ways to make money, because I was hoping that just a fraction of the audience that listened would step up on Patreon and become patrons and be part of that insider chat. But anyway, trying to think of other ways, you guys don't want to do that, to support the podcast. Another goal was to do some scouting and or killing of bear and mountain lion, as it is season. And the tags here where I'm at are $16, so I bought one of each. And although that part wasn't a success, I shot no bear or mountain lion. Yet, on this trip, it was a great trip. So let me talk about what the idea was. So I wanted to get solitude, which for me means not hiking on a trail, which for me means not going on a road, which for me means not going places other people go. By definition, solitude means you're alone. So I stepped back, thought critically, which is a skill I've talked about before on the Alpha Male podcast. Looked on maps, scouted out some areas that went into Wilderness National Forest. Now I just looked it up and it says the national forest I went to was 1.8 million acres. And I know it touches at least one more national forest, the Six Rivers National Forest, which is huge. Well, that's a whole lot of wilderness. But some of those have trails and stuff like that, which I'm not really interested in. That's not my style. Not for this, anyway. So I took a canoe, which I bought used very cheaply and plan to sell for about the same amount of money when I leave here, because if you don't know, my wife and I live semi-nomadically to help cut down on the cost of living and be able to do this podcast. So I bought a canoe used very cheaply. I have quite a bit of experience canoeing, which played into this. I bought one very cheaply and I plan to sell it for the same price when I leave, so didn't really consider digging into savings too much because I plan to sell it when I leave. And looked for a creek, a stream that was not navigable by traditional means, meaning like you couldn't just take a motorboat up it. There was really no way to get up above and come down on it, meaning going downstream, which is what most people would do with a canoe. So I basically devised a rig to wade in this creek. I had reconnoitered, I had done some recon beforehand and thought roughly about how big the creek was. I knew that I could ford it if I had to, meaning cross it. And I hauled this canoe upstream, like tied ropes around me and big pieces of elastic, and hauled this canoe behind me with trekking poles and hauled upstream, which is pretty arduous. And where it got too rocky for that, I literally man-hauled this canoe over rocks by literally yanking it and pulling it up over rocks, basically rock crawling with a canoe, which was actually a lot more labor-intensive than I had anticipated, but a lot of fun. Pretty dangerous. Would not recommend it. But that was the idea, to go up this unnavigable stream or creek, and if something happened, it would be easier to get back in theory, and much faster because I would be in the canoe going downstream for most of it where I could. So that's what I did. I hauled about, I think, 7 hours worth of doing that, both trekking upstream and man-hauling that canoe up some pretty crazy boulders and rocks and things like that, with the Rhodesian Ridgeback Alexander Hamilton. And spend the night out in the wilderness under a poncho, what is referred to in the military as a poncho hooch, like basically a very crude shelter made out of a poncho, in the rainforest of the Pacific Northwest, and head back downstream the next day and connect with the Rogue River, which runs next to the house. So I could get back home if I didn't have any comms or anything. Because for most of it, there was no reception or anything. I thought once I got back to the main part of the Rogue River, at least at some point, I would be able to get comms. If not, I would eventually run into a place I know I could get home by hiking home. So that was the plan. By God's grace, obviously made it back. I am still breathing. I am uninjured, although quite a bit sore after that trip, as you can imagine. But that's about it. It was a great trip. As for the prime directive, spending time alone in the wilderness with God, check. Awesome. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows us his handiwork. That's the number one lesson. You guys need to, I don't care what it is for you, get some solitude. Get out and spend time with your Creator, your Maker, with God. Be circumspect. Consider God. Consider what you're supposed to be doing. Consider life. It's good and healthy. Be still and know that I am God. Some other lesser lessons learned, but you can still glean from if you consider yourself a survivalist, a wilderness person, a bug-out person. Now, I've lived all over the U.S., but I spent my last several years in the Southwest, Arizona, Nevada, and I took for granted how little stuff corrodes and rusts there. And I had quite the eye-opener in the Pacific Northwest, literally living in the rainforest on the coast. It seems like stuff just wants to rust all the time. You have to work hard to keep it from rusting. So that's one. If you are not from that area, you're not accustomed to it. Now, I grew up in the South, and it's like that there, but I had been away. I joined the Marine Corps at 17, well over 20 years ago. So I had to relearn that stuff just wants to rust. Even stuff that I would consider really good steel. Before I went on this trip, my bug-out bag, which I keep behind the front seat, good place for it, was one of my go-to ARs in there, and I hadn't checked it in a few weeks, and I pulled it out of the backpack I have. Is kind of constructed so that there's a long gun holder in between, like where the pack frame is and where the cargo carrying starts on that pack. And I pulled it out, and there was rust on it. Thankfully, by God's grace, none on the nitrided barrel and stuff like that, but on a lot of the controls, the safety, the forward assist, they were rusty, and that kind of ticked me off. Because God gives you a resource, and you should take care of that thing. And I had not been doing my due diligence to stay on top of that. I had taken a bunch of my guns when I got here and lubed them up heavily for storage that I wasn't going to be using. And by say a bunch, I don't have a ton of guns. I'm not a gun collector all the way. Really enjoy guns, as you might surmise from gunfighter life. That's one that I didn't think about, and it got rusty. So that's on me. Also, I've been trying to sell a few things on eBay to raise capital for the podcast and just for life. And I had a knife that I bought a while ago that turned out to be a highly collectible knife, as it was the only one of that design made in like S35VM, which is like a really high quality stainless steel. And I thought, I'll sell that sucker on eBay, replace it with a knife that I don't care about beating up, because I didn't buy it to be a collector. I bought it to be a useful knife. And I'll replace it with a good, useful knife, and I'll put the rest, towards life and podcast and whatever. And I pulled it out of the sheath. It's super rusty, even though it's, again, touted as being a really good steel. Is rusty, which kind of ruined the collector value. So I guess the bright side of that is, by God's grace, I'll keep it and use it and won't feel bad about it, because the collector value is kind of gone now. That's a big lesson learned. If you're going to take a trip to go bear hunting in the Pacific Northwest or to Georgia and you're from somewhere else, stuff rusts. So keep an eye on that. Another reason I went is to do some T&E. Another plan I have to raise some capital is to do some cool things. As far as merchandise go, I already have some merchandise, just branded Alpha Male Podcast merchandise that I mentioned. So I have the merchandise, but I plan on doing what I'm going to call bailout bags. If you've listened, you know I'm big on the concept of mini bug out bags, and I hope that you already have your own or make your own. But I know that a lot of men won't do that, so I'm trying to make some really good ones and sell those. Part of this was T&E, working out of mine. Also, an idea that I have after that, if that works, is survival scabbards for what I think is the ultimate survival weapon, which is a shotgun. And basically, it's a survival scabbard that you can wear on your back or attach to a Molly backpack or put behind the front seat of your car. And literally, you can throw the shotgun. It'll be fine. It's not just some cheap nylon scabbard. It's actually got padding and stuff in there. Like a good military-grade beat-up shotgun scabbard with shotgun ammo attachments and a double sling to wear like a backpack, or you can wear it like a sling bag. Anyway, part of this trip was T&E on that, and I learned some lessons on how to configure that better by actual hard use and beating the crap out of it and figuring out better ways to configure stuff, which that's a win because I did. It would have been cool if I had shot a bear or a mountain lion, which was one of the goals, but I didn't. But that T&E and gear, anybody that knows me in real life knows that I'm pretty hard on stuff. Got nice stuff, by God's grace, good guns, good gear, but I use it. I don't have any safe queens. Even my grandfather's old double barrel AH Fox, well over 100 years old, I still take it out and hunt with it. A couple of things I forgot on the trip. I forgot to clean the canoe. I had went on an excursion that turned out to be a lot longer than I thought before with the canoe. Just getting refamiliar with it turned into a pretty hectic and crazy ordeal. Weather got pretty bad on us. Anyway, took the wife on that one. We got a little stranded, got a little wet, quite a bit wet actually. But anyway, all turned out well, but the canoe was filthy and I should have cleaned it before I left because it was literally right by a spigot where I could have washed it off, and I didn't, so I had to deal with a muddy canoe to start with. That was stupid. Also, I almost always wear the same thing EDC day to day, and one of those is a long sleeve shirt. Whether I'm in the desert, whether I'm in the city, whatever. Go-to I've talked about before is a Bone Tactical shirt. Bone Tactical. I'm not affiliated with them. I don't get any kickback from them. The guy makes really good shirts, especially for EDC and concealed carry. I almost always am wearing one. And that day I had just jumped in the truck with everything else with the canoe on top and forgotten that shirt. I had to lather myself in sunblock, which is not my favorite. I don't like doing that. Also, forgot to reapply sunblock, and when I got back, my face looked like an alligator because I had gotten quite a bit of sun. It adds up when you're, outside all day, all night. Anyway, lessons learned. All the extra stuff, make sure you have all your regular EDC stuff. Also, sunblock, as I learned, as my wife told me, is not a once on and forget kind of thing. Now, I'm Italian, I don't burn that easily, but yeah, if I'm outside all day in the sun, I'll burn. And I did. So there's a lesson learned, or relearned. Actually reading the sunblock and seeing how long it's good for, that's probably important. One of the things I didn't forget, but I want to pass on to you guys in case you don't know. When you're gathering wood for a fire, a good rule of thumb is gather 3 times more than you think. Whatever you think you're going to use, gather about 3 times more than that. And you may have a little bit left over, but you're probably going to use way more than you think. Fire burns fast. Another good thing is if you're making a fire, like let's say I built a fire on this trip, which I did. I didn't need a big roaring fire. I needed enough to warm myself back up, get my feet warm because they had been wet most of the day. Cook a fish that I had caught by God's grace, and boil some water. And that's it. I didn't need a big roaring fire. But either way, whatever I thought I was going to need, gather 3 times the amount of wood you think you're going to need, because you're going to probably need more than you think. That goes for tinder. Nothing in building a fire can be more frustrating than you are out in the wilderness or wherever, and you finally get a spark into a flame, and you get it going, and you don't have enough tinder, and it burns out because it's not big enough to start the bigger stuff that you have for a fire. So whatever tinder you think you need, have 3 times as much. Much better to gather it and have it on hand and not need it than to get that spark into a flame and finally get it going and you can't start your fire because you don't have any of that intermediate tinder to catch your sticks or your twigs or anything like that. Doing that prep work, having the right materials to start that fire beforehand really pays off. So that's a lesson learned there on fire. Another big one for fire is, just like I took for granted stuff not rusting in Arizona and Nevada, I really took for granted how easy it was to start fires out there because everything is dry. There's not the abundance of wood and stuff in a lot of environments, but there's usually stuff that will burn, dry dead grass, sage, and it's not hard to find dry stuff in the desert that will burn. That's pretty easy. It's a lot harder in the Pacific Northwest rainforest to find stuff that's dry that will burn. Everything there is damp. I can't say everything, but pretty much everything in that environment, it's a rainforest. It's hard to find stuff for tinder. That's another thing. That's actually something I had to learn because it's a lot wetter environment even generally than in the South. So if you think you're just going to go out with your ferrocerium rod and your knife and be able to start a fire with just in a minute, that's not really realistic. Make sure you, even if you don't go out in the wilderness, go outside. Go out in your backyard and gather materials, natural materials, and see what you can do with that. Get a fire started with a spark. Now, don't light your house on fire or anything. If you're a kid, make sure you have permission to your parents or whatever. But that's a really good, useful alpha male skill to have. Being able to start a fire with natural things with just a spark. The next one, how good a useful knife is. Like a good usable knife. Not like a little teeny pocket Swiss Army knife or something like that. Like a good, useful, big knife. You'll know one of my go-to recommendations is a Buck 110 Slim. If you want to carry it on a pouch or you're more traditional, just a regular Buck 110 will do pretty much everything that you need. If you're out in the wilderness like this, and for my day-to-day EDC, I generally carry a little bit larger fixed blade. Like today, when I'm done podcasting, if I get a couple of podcasts out, I'm probably going to go in the wilderness. Hopefully catch dinner for tonight. Save some cost of living expenses. But anyway, a good fixed blade knife, I use that a lot on this trip. Also, a little teeny knife. I kind of knocked the little teeny Swiss Army knife. I wouldn't want that to be all that I had, but I probably use that just as much as the big knife. I want to keep that big knife sharp. Having that little tiny knife for a lot of little tiny tasks is a good thing. About pulling, briars and thorns, or when I was in the Southwest, cactus out of my skin, out of my flesh, things like that. That's a real thing that happens. Little tiny, I forget what they call the smallest but kind of quintessential really tiny Swiss Army knife. I usually carry one of those in my pocket as part of my EDC with my big knife. That thing comes in handy a lot. As I alluded to, we did quite a bit of rock climbing and man-hauling that canoe, and by we I mean myself and Alexander Hamilton, the Ridgeback. Quite good at rock climbing. He impresses me a lot. I think only I had to lift him and shove him up over rocks once. He's quite athletic. He snapped off some dew claws. I was able to handle that with that little knife. Cut the rest of them off, trim them, even file the remainder thereof down. I think it's important as a man to have a good go-to EDC knife, just for in the wilderness, but all the time. I've talked about this before, and I think my number one recommendation is the Buck 110 Slim. Most people are not going to carry a fixed blade. They're just not. I do almost always. I say almost always. I do have an ultralight EDC, which I've talked about, but I almost always carry a fixed blade, but I almost always carry a smaller EDC knife, that little teeny Swiss Army knife, because again, sometimes you don't want to mess up your good blade on something that's really bad for it. Sometimes you just want a tiny blade or another useful tool. Trying to pry something open or something like that, I don't want to use my big, nice fixed blade. I want to keep that sharp and ready. And then at night when I'm making camp, making shelter, butchering an animal, taking care of fish, whatever, that knife is there and ready. Or if an emergency, I have to cut myself free of my harness or my rope, like when I was man-hauling that canoe, if I'd have fallen in rapids, and there's some pretty legit rapids there that could have sucked me under. I don't want to be tied into a bunch of crap. If I need to cut stuff away from me really quick when I'm underwater in a whirlpool, that's when I want that fixed blade knife at my side ready to go. That was a very likely scenario in this endeavor. Which brings me to one of my other failures. I'm going to be honest, I should have worn a life jacket when I was crawling up and down those rapids. I am a good swimmer. I was a lifeguard for quite a while. Trying to swim in those kind of currents in rapids can take down even some of the best and strongest swimmers. Wearing a life jacket would have been a good idea, and I had to haul it anyway. I should have just had it on just in case. That was a failure on my part. By God's grace, I didn't need it. Hamilton actually did fall into some pretty gnarly rapids. By God's grace, he got out of them, but he very easily could have drowned. And he also had a life jacket, and I didn't have it on him. Lesson learned, I should have had those life jackets on. Kind of pain in the butt, yes. Would I have worn it for the whole trip? No, but I should have worn it when we were in those rapids. Another thing that I forgot, I brought my fishing rod. I grabbed a bunch of stuff out of the truck that I had made a list to grab, and I forgot my tackle. Forgot my little tackle box that I have. I don't have a lot of tackle, just like I don't have a lot of guns, but I have what I would consider like the essentials, and I forgot it. Thankfully, in my survival and in my EDC, I carry wrapped around my EDC knife a couple of hooks, fish line. I have some in my bailout bag, my baby bug out bag, and my big bug out bag. I kind of have a system. And I didn't go repacking a bunch of stuff for this trip. I grabbed my baby bug out bag and my bug out bag for a reason. I took the AR out because I didn't figure I'd need it on the trip. I took a shotgun instead, more practical tool to put meat on the table. But anyway, without going too far down a rabbit hole, I had a couple of fish hooks. I had a fishing rod, so I didn't have to improvise that. But I made a fishing lure out of a fish hook, a piece of aluminum foil that I had on some of my food, and some food packaging, that kind of packaging foil, and a rock. And I used it, and it was successful. I hooked quite a few fish, and I was able to catch one for dinner out of a lure that I made out of a rock, and aluminum foil, and a fish hook that I had had as part of my kit. Very literally, by God's grace, able to feed myself with that ingenuity. It can be done. And it wasn't just, it was a trout, which are known for being kind of elusive. Rainbow cutthroat trout are kind of known for being elusive and hard to catch animals. Fish, anyway. And I hooked 3, and here's another big lesson I had to relearn. I love to fish, and a lot of times I fish for sport. So when I hooked my first fish or 2, I was treating them like a sport fisherman. I was playing them out. I was letting them run the drag out. I hooked one that was fairly large, and they got off. If you're fishing for survival, I just did a episode on fishing for survival if you want to listen to that. But I should have, as soon as I hooked them, literally reeled them in as fast as I could and drug them up on the shore. I was not sport fishing. I was literally fishing for food. I probably would have landed at least one more, maybe that really big one. I treated those fish like what they were, food, instead of sport. I love fishing for sport. This was not that day. I was fishing for food, and I should have treated them thus. I kind of had to fight against that automaticity. That's just kind of my thing. I've fished my whole life, and I like fighting a fish on a line. But I had strong enough line, I could have just drug that fish literally as fast as I could and slung it up on the land so it couldn't get off. But it was really cool. I didn't intentionally leave my tackle behind, but it was really cool to make fishing tackle out of a rock and some aluminum foil and fashion it to look like a dying minnow and actually catch trout. That was pretty cool. The bigger lesson in that is almost always, no matter how good you plan or think you're going to know the scenario, you're almost always going to forget something or have to improvise even if you don't forget anything. So that old adage from the Marine Corps, improvise, adapt, overcome. Having that high GT score, being able to improvise, being able to look at something and think, how can I solve this problem? Yeah, it would be great if I had a lure, but I don't. How can I solve this problem with what I have? Another big lesson, and I know this, and I know better, but I got carried away trying to cover a bunch of ground and get way, way into the backcountry, and I was already way in the backcountry the first hour, let alone several hours later. But I waited too long to set up camp. I can set up camp in the dark. I did set up camp in the dark, but I didn't have to. I should have set up camp earlier, and that's a lesson learned that I shouldn't have had to relearn, but I did, and I'm sharing it with you guys. If you're out on an adventure like this, or you're out in a survival scenario, set up camp before you think you need to. When that sun starts to go down, it goes down quickly. I couldn't just camp anywhere along this backwater wilderness stream. There was a lot of areas where it was really steep rocky banks, literally boulders. And that was it. There was boulders and water. There was some areas that had beaches and areas suitable for camping. But they weren't all over the place. You had to find one and pick one. So the ground that I covered, it started to get dark and I had to backtrack and go back anyway. Because where I was, there was no area that I could see for camping and I didn't see anything up ahead for camping. And again, once it starts to get dark, it gets dark quickly. So the lesson learned there is make camp before it gets dark. You can make camp in the dark, but it's a lot easier not to. A lot easier to give yourself a little bit of extra time and have that extra time when the sun's going down. Plus, then you get to enjoy the sun going down. And the sun setting in the wilderness is a glorious thing, and I'd rather be able to kick back and enjoy it than try and get my shelter set up before sundown or in the dark. So make camp before you think you need to. Give yourself plenty of time to make camp. Now, the camp that I made for this excursion, I alluded to, if you're not familiar with the poncho and poncho liner of the military, if you don't have those as part of your kit, even if you're not a prepper, not a survivalist, they're awesome. You should probably have one. It's kind of like a pocket knife, although not as commonly used. If you're just a urban suburbanite, having a poncho and poncho liner in your trunk is probably a good idea. But the military poncho is very versatile. You can use it obviously as a poncho. You can use it for a lot of things. You can use it for carrying casualties if somebody gets wounded. You can use it as a shelter. It's big enough to use as a shelter to sleep under, which is what we did. By we, I mean the dog and I. Now I made kind of a teepee. 3 long straight sticks lashed together at the top of 550 cord, about 5 or 6 feet tall, with the poncho draped over to make like a mini teepee. It wasn't crazy cold and quite a high humidity index, so I wanted to be able to be okay if it rained pretty hard, but also be able to air out so all that air wasn't trapped in there. If it was, low humidity and 10 degrees outside, freezing cold, would have built that shelter differently. But I was able to get that set up. But I kind of over-engineered it. Looking back on that, lessons learned, I didn't have to make a teepee, although it was cool and it worked out well. I literally camped next to a cliff face with a bunch of stuff growing out of it. I could have just grabbed a piece of 550 cord, tied it on there, tied the other end to a rock, a big rock, thrown it out into the sand, and just made a much simpler shelter that would have worked equally as well. Either way, it worked out pretty good. Slept under that with the poncho liner with Hamilton. He is quite warm when it's cold out, to our mutual benefit. I wrapped him up in one of my old army jackets, and we were under the poncho liner. Poncho liner, commonly referred to as a whoopee, is another awesome piece of kit, perhaps one of the best things the military ever designed. And talking about using the dog for body heat, that's another thing, lessons learned. Be a student of history. That goes broader than just this one lesson, but I have read and understand that the Aborigines actually use these at night to keep warm. They use dogs to keep warm. And guess what? It works. It works really well. I love my dog. He is a great dog. He's probably, honestly, by far the best dog I've ever had. But he still pulls some weight. He's useful for that. He's useful to keep warm at night. He was shivering pretty hard. We were pretty wet before that. It's to our mutual benefit. Also, I used him to haul the canoe on, not on the crazy stretches, because I didn't think he'd be able to comprehend what he was supposed to do. So I hauled it over the big rocks and stuff like that. But I did use him when it was pretty easy going and pretty stable as far as depth goes. We wouldn't get in too deep. But I did use him to haul the canoe upstream on the straight, flat stretches. I don't consider dogs to be house decorations. I consider them to be useful animals. Hamilton has already treed 2 bears, which I'm thankful for. It wasn't season, so I couldn't shoot them. But he treed a mother with cubs, which I was walking up on doing something else, doing another wilderness task. Who knows how that would have turned out if he had not treed that bear and alerted me before I got there. That could have been very bad. Walking up on a mother bear with cubs is not a recipe for success historically. So he pulls weight in that wilderness excursion relationship. He's not just there for decoration. One of the things I forgot for him, I did remember a life jacket, or I rather should say I made him one out of a harness that he had anyway, and some foam that we had out of another life jacket. Kind of fashioned one that worked pretty well. But he has a neoprene kind of wetsuit because, again, it's cold when you're wet all day in the rainforest. Those cold, clear creeks. And he has one, and that's something I forgot. He just had to deal with it. But it would have been better if he'd have had it. He'd have been far warmer and far more comfortable. Another lesson learned, I should have brought more food. I did not eat the whole second day until I got back to civilization. You burn a lot of calories doing stuff like hauling a canoe upstream. I took a bunch of food out of my pack. I didn't have to. My pack wasn't that heavy to start with. As I said, my bug-out bag stays behind the front seat of the car. That's another lesson learned. Have it where you can grab it and go. But I had quite a bit of food in there. In fact, a lot. A lot more than I ever would have needed on this trip. But I took too much out. I should have kept more in there. Also, Ham was quite a bit stressed out at times, Hamilton. And instead of eating his dog food, he ate some of my food because he likes it better and he'll eat it even when he's stressed. So, some of my food went there. Anyway, lesson learned. Should have brought more food. Not that big a deal. You can go without food for a while. You're not going to die. Unless it's a long while. As I talked about earlier, made a fire. And as I talked about earlier, lessons learned from history. I recently read and did a podcast on a book, Empire of the Summer Moon, about the Comanches. And one of the things they talked about for the Comanches there was a gunpowder cloth. And as soon as I mentioned that in that book, I thought, that's a really good idea, gunpowder cloth. So I had one with me. Just a piece of cloth or paper rubbed with gunpowder that will light easily. That was really nice. I have sat in there and taken several hours to find a tree that hadn't fallen down with some loose punk wood under the bark and got my ferro rod and got our fire started. I probably could have. Since my EDC knife already had a ferrocerium rod on it, it's part of my EDC with a cap, goes on the ferro rod to help it be easier to grasp. Just putting a small amount of gunpowder and or gunpowder cloth in there really came in super handy. Again, another lesson learned. Rainforest is a hard place to start a fire. Lessons learned from history that came in handy, just like learning about the Aborigines. Once a fire got started, another lesson learned. Like I said, I waited too long to get camp, longer than I should have. It was late. I've talked to people like, how are you going to get clean water in a survival scenario? And they say, just boil water. Well, I had several ways to get water. And I thought that night I would boil some water. A water system, a metal canteen, a metal canteen cup. So I thought I'll boil some water. I'm already making a fire. Boiling water takes a long time. And I know that. I'm talking about like on a propane stove. I'm talking about on an actual fire. It takes a long time. It was like midnight before I got to bed. For the rest of the trip, I just threw iodine tablets in water. It's a much easier, much more effective way. They weigh very, very little. Not very expensive at Walmart. I already knew that. That's how I'd gotten my water earlier that day. That's how I got it the next day. But I thought at night, I'm making camp, I'm making a fire, I'll boil some water. It's a lot of time and a lot of energy to gather enough wood to boil a significant amount of water. Especially if you're doing that kind of manual labor, you're going to want to drink a lot of water. Probably not going to have the time or the energy to boil your own water if you're on the move. Boiling water is, I'm not saying it's not viable, but it's not very practical in all but a sedentary, stationary survival environment. If I had a bunch of metal containers and a bunch of ways to boil water, I was just hanging out all day and had a fire going all day, yeah, I could probably boil water and have enough to survive and drink. But being on the move and trying to do that, it takes a long time, one, to gather stuff for a fire, to build a fire, to start a fire, and to boil water. That takes a long time. It took, I want to say, about 4 hours to get that water boiling, and that was just one metal canteen and canteen cup. Boiling water takes a lot of time. That's a lesson learned, and a lesson you should glean from this if you don't know that. Think, oh, I'm just going to bring a metal cup and boil water. You can do it, but it is quite time and labor intensive. Those water purification tablets, or if you can't, they're not expensive. But if you don't have those, just a way to carry a little bit of bleach and look up the right ratio of bleach per water to make it safe. That water probably would have been fine. It was some of the cleanest, clearest water I've ever seen. But I also know that drinking dirty water is a major killer in survival scenarios. It's not worth the risk if I don't have to take it. Most of your city water has chlorine and stuff like that in it anyway. You get the iodine tablets. Iodine is actually a good thing for you and for your body, so there's no really issue there. Anyway, lesson learned. Water is not something you want to mess around with. Have multiple ways to get clean water. Number one way is like a Sawyer Mini, and I didn't use that on this trip because I use it all the time when I go on my little mini excursions. Trying to, like I said, test and evaluate and do other things on this trip. Add that if I needed it. Certainly use it a lot in the past, especially on hunting and fishing trips. This time, I did the iodine and boiling water. But boiling water, again, takes a long time. So remember that, glean from that what you can. One of the things also that I have changed on my EDC, I carried a wallet on this trip. I probably didn't need to because it's not useful for anything. It's just part of my EDC and I forgot about it. But if I'm going to carry it anyway, I carry a really minimalist wallet. Usually like a hunting license and a few cards on there. Concealed carry permit, driver's license, a couple of ways of payment, and that's really it. It's really minimal. But I threw in a couple of Write in the Rain pages. You might want to consider that for your EDC or for your baby bug out bag. And in a really wet environment like that, even though I got very wet, all you have to do is really brush those off or shake those off, and they still burn really well. You collect natural tinder and go out and go on an excursion and find a dead log that's standing upright and find dry wood to start tinder, you can. It's a lot easier, especially if you're injured or something like that, to pull out a couple of pages of Write in the Rain paper. Look those notebooks up if you don't know. They're big in the military, but they pretty much will write anytime, wet, dry, whatever. They'll also burn pretty much anytime. If you're injured, twisted your ankle, instead of going for a mile around your camp looking for dry tinder, you're able to pull that out of your wallet. Now I have one in my dope card for my weapon, which I normally have. Just having one or two to take up almost no room in your wallet to get a fire started. They're essentially just really thick wax paper and they burn really well, and it doesn't really matter if they get wet. So that's an awesome thing to just quick, easy, cheap way to upgrade your EDC. Lesson learned there, just have it. I'm all about being ultra light and stuff like that. What do 2 little tiny pieces of notebook paper, wax paper weigh? Very, very little. Alright, man, I just paused and looked at how long this episode is going. It's a long episode, and I didn't think it was going to be. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm sure there are other lessons that I have learned on this trip that I may mention in future episodes. I also would like to do an entire one on the gear that was used, maybe the gear that wasn't used or overrated. Some things you take and you don't use but you still need them, like my sidearm. Because what if I had run into a bear, a wolf, or a mountain lion, which are all around? or a two-legged predator, even though it's deep in the wilderness, or a tourniquet, which I'm thankful I didn't need, but it's part of my EDC day to day. Thankful I didn't need a tourniquet, but I still had it. But maybe I'll do an entire list of maybe my line 1, line 2, and line 3 gear for this expedition, if you guys want that. Reach out to me. Let me know if you want that. Let me know if you want to hear about anything else. I'm not unapproachable. GoodShepherdTraining.com. There's a contact me link on there. Patrons pretty much have access to me all the time. We talk pretty much every day except for Sabbath. Sabbath I rest. They have access on Patreon. They also have a group chat, which I am involved in and very humbled and blessed to be a part of. If you want to be part of a like-minded tribe that talk about this kind of stuff and much more, you can do that by becoming a patron. If you want to support other ways, there's a simple Venmo link on there. If you're like, hey, this podcast is worth $1, throw out $1. If you want to help feed a hungry Alexander Hamilton, maybe I was joking around with my wife, maybe I should put like a picture of him in a sad face on the website saying, help feed, play a sad song. But I'm not going to do that. He is not at all malnourished. He does eat a lot of food. He is 110 pounds. Last time I weighed him, and that was a while ago, and he's still growing. He's still a puppy. In fact, his birthday is this month sometime. Anyway, GoodShepherdTraining.com if you want to contact me. If you want to become a patron. In fact, click on the patron link that's on the website. GoodShepherdTraining.com. I'll also put the Patreon link straight on there. But if you go, even if you don't want to become a patron, click on it. Yes, after talking about all this, I'll do a post and I'll put in a bunch of the pictures. If you want to check out what I'm talking about, if you're a more visual person, put up a picture, let's say, of the poncho hooch, the shelter. Put up a picture of the fish that I caught and the lure that I made out of just basically improvising it and catching a fish and cooking it for dinner. Maybe a picture of what man-hauling that canoe looks like. I'll do a post, and instead of just making it for patrons on Patreon, go to Patreon and I'll make it a public post so everybody that goes there can see it. So if you're interested in seeing what I'm talking about, you can check that out. Again, GoodShepherdTraining.com. With that, men, I want to say thanks for listening to all of that. Although they'll automatically put ads in the front and back of the podcast, I won't put any in the middle since I already kind of advertised GoodShepherdTraining.com. And as a thanks for listening, I'll throw out a tactical tip, another one, although there was quite a few in this episode. As per the normal, a tactical tip and a tactical verse of the day. Got quite wet on this trip. One way to keep stuff dry, especially small stuff, just your regular drinking straws that you get when you go to a restaurant or establishment or Dutch Brothers or whatever. A regular old drinking straw. You heat that up to the point where it starts to melt and not burn, you can take a pair of needle nose pliers and crimp it down. Fill it with whatever you want to fill it with, and do the same on the other side. It takes some practice to get the temperatures right, but, what are you out? A straw? But make these an inch or two long and fill them with whatever you want to keep dry. Now, by God's grace, I don't take any medication, but if you wanted to put medication in here, a multivitamin or something in here, that didn't dissolve or get wet in your pocket, you do have to take a medication, make that part of your EDC, put it in one of these containers. Use it for that gunpowder cloth that I talked about. Just cheap cloth or tissue paper rubbed with gunpowder. You could fill one with Neosporin. Whatever you'd want a small, pretty robust actually, and watertight container for. Now obviously they're single use, but who cares? Again, it's a straw. Don't know what a pack of straws costs, so I just give them when they give them to me. I don't generally drink a drink with a straw. And I almost never go out to eat. But even I can find a straw here and there. So anyway, that's your tactical tip. Making waterproof containers out of straws. If you didn't know about it, it's a thing. For whatever thing you may want to put in there. That's your tactical tip of the day. The tactical verse of the day we alluded to in the beginning. Do you consider yourself a follower of Jesus Christ? Well, men, if not, then you should be. It is the number one choice you should have made in your life thus far. And if you haven't, repent and turn to Christ. But if you consider yourself a disciple of Christ, here's what Jesus tells his disciples. Mark chapter 6. And he said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. It doesn't have to be the same thing that I did, but I think it's good and healthy, and Jesus obviously told his disciples to get out from the hustle and bustle sometimes into a deserted place and rest a while. Another verse, be still and know that I am God. With that, men, thanks for listening to the Alpha Male Podcast, and have a blessed day.